Yes, the stage is yours.
Okay, I'm going to present you the paper Accessing the Unsaid, the role of scalar alternatives in children's pragmatic inference by Neil Brooks, Alan Bale, and David Barner. I think this is a pretty new paper, but I'm not sure. I think it's from the year 2016. And before I start presenting, I just want to say that I did shorten the presentation because the introduction starts about the other studies that have been made, for example, by Huang and Papafrago and Musolino, and I just didn't want to include them because it would be way too long.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay, some general information about the study. The study tested the hypothesis that children's difficulty computing implicatures is caused by a failure to generate relevant alternatives. So basically saying that children lack the knowledge of relevant lexical alternatives to words like some, so the quantifier some. And they asked if children could strengthen their interpretation of utterances when containing the quantifier some with the word only, with the focus word only. Okay, the critical trials in this experiment presented situations involving 3 different things, for example, 3 animals sleeping. And then they asked the children to evaluate one of the questions in 6, which you can see on the screen. So are some of the animals reading? Are only some of the animals reading? Are the cat and the dog reading? Or are the dog and the cat reading? So the authors basically say that if the children's difficulty computing the implicatures for the context-independent scales is due to a failure to access the alternatives, they should accept the statements in 6a and 6b. And it doesn't matter if the word only is present. But in contrast, that they should have no difficulty strengthening the sentence in 6d, for example, because this one is contextually specified. Okay, the participants were 64-year-old participants, so children, and 2 of them were excluded because they failed to complete the task. Okay, moving on to the stimuli in the procedure. The stimuli were 12 picture cards, and each of these picture cards depicted a scene of 3 items. 4 of these cards were used in a familiarization phase and 8 in the test phase. And the familiarization cards depicted sets of animals with distinct characteristics, for example, color or clothing. And the test cards depicted 4 different scenes, which you can also see on the screen. And you can also see an example of a card. So basically, firstly, Cookie Monster holding a fruit, an orange, an apple, and a banana. Animals sleeping, a dog, a cat, and a cow. And animals reading, a dog, a cat, and a rabbit. Toys on a table, a ball, a drum, and a train. And they created 2 versions of each scene. One in which all of the 3 items share the property. For example, Cookie Monster is holding all of the 3 fruits. And one in which only 2 of that 3 items share the property. For example, the Cookie Monster is holding 2 fruits and 1 is on the floor. They asked the children to identify each animal. For example, by asking, what is this? That's right, it's a cow. And if the child couldn't label the animal correctly, they were given the correct label and encouraged to repeat it. So basically saying, that's a cow, can you say cow? They were asked questions about each scene, and this was made to make sure that they could answer both yes and no to the questions. And if a child answered any question incorrectly, the experimenter would move on to the next memorization card, but returned back after completing all of the rest of the cards. And if the child failed twice, they would just end the testing session. So there were 9 trials using the test cards again, asking the children to identify all of the items and then to evaluate the truth value of the statement. And each of the children participated in one of the 4 conditions. Condition 1 and 3 were the context-independent alternatives, so basically including the quantifier some. For example, is the Cookie Monster holding some or all of the fruit? In condition 2 and 4, these were the contextual alternatives, so they just labeled them separately, the individuals, the animals, the fruits. For example, is the Cookie Monster holding the banana, the apple, and the orange. And all of these conditions were identical, except for the condition 3 and 4. These were the grammatically exhaustifying conditions, and the word only was inserted. So for example, are only some of the animals reading, or are only the dog and the rabbit reading? Okay, so on the 2-item false questions, there were only 2 of the 3 items that fit the description. And the children were asked whether the description was true for all of the items. So for example, is the Cookie Monster holding all of the fruit, or is the Cookie Monster holding the apple, the orange, and the banana? And these were also used as control trials to see if the children were attending to the task. On the 2-item true questions, also again, 2 of the 3 items fit the description, and they asked the children if the description was true for a subset of the items. So for example, are only some of the animals reading, or are only the rabbit and the dog reading? And lastly, on the 3-item test, all of the 3 items fit the description. And again, the children were asked if the description was true for a subset of the items. And all of these questions were identical in the 2-item true and 3-item test trials. Also, one thing to say that the experimenter didn't change the procedure at all when saying some or only, which is also important. And the 2-item false trial were excluded because they expected the children to reject these sentences anyway. Okay, on to the results. Overall, the children were significantly more likely to accept the sentences on 2-item true trials with 87.9%, than on the 3-item test trials with 59.6%. I think this means a percentage of 0.1. And they were also less likely to accept sentences with only, such as only the drum and the ball are on the table, with 84.8% of the trials, than those that did not contain only, so 62.7%. On the picture in the presentation, you can see the percentage of the children who said yes to the questions in the contextual alternatives conditions. And as expected, adding the word only had no effect on either of these trial types, except for the critical 3-item test trials, because they tested with contextual alternatives, and then they were highly sensitive to the word only. When asked for the word some, so the context-independent alternatives conditions, they also correctly said yes on 2-item true trials with 80%, and correctly said no with 87.2% of the trials. Yeah, basically the children strengthened their interpretation of utterances when they included the element only, but only if the alternatives were provided contextually. So basically if they had a context. And for the context-independent scales, so some and all, they failed to compute implicatures, even when the only was added. Okay, basically the authors say that the children's failure to derive strengthened readings for some must be attributed to a failure to generate the relevant scalar alternatives, and that the difficulties are not purely because of the processing constraints, and that the children were perfectly fine, capable of strengthening the interpretations that involve contextual alternatives, but they failed to do so with the sentences that included some. They also go on to say that no previous study has provided the evidence that this is solely a problem for processing limits or working memory, and why it would affect the Horn scales. So they conclude saying that the processing limits are not the root of the children's difficulties, and they say that the children lack a knowledge that is scale specific, and that it would be better that children learn the meanings of the scale mates and how these meanings differ in informational strength in different contexts. So basically that using one, for example, implies that the other one is not true. And yeah, that's it.
Okay, thank you. Just
I'm sorry, it was very long, but I couldn't shorten it. Otherwise, it just would you wouldn't understand it.
It was fine. It was fine. I just wanted to ask you something about the core results. So because I didn't quite understand that from the graphs that you showed. So when they had the only sum condition, right? If you can go back to the picture.
This one? Or the other
Yeah.
one? This
So
one.
yeah. Or even the picture of the experiment, right? If you go, yeah. So when they said, for instance, with this picture, only some animals read the book, where there was a picture with 3 animals reading the book, the children accepted that anyway. Is that what happened? I'm sorry, I'm not sure I understood that.
No, as I understood, they didn't accept with the sum. They only accepted if they said the cat is sleeping or the rabbit is reading. But if they said the cat and the dog are reading, then they didn't accept it.
No,
if
I know.
I understood it.
I know.
Yeah.
But like, what happened when only was modifying some, right?
Oh, yeah, I know what you mean. Just a second. I think that that they say that, as in the other studies, the utterances containing some in the absence of only did not strengthen anything. So they did not strengthen what they said.
Which
I think
means
they had no real correlation. How do you say? How correlation? Yeah.
right. So
Basically, they didn't affect each other in this context.
right, but oh, so like means that they accepted the violation basically, or not? So that's what I'm not sure I got. So I'm looking at the yeah, I mean, they dub this condition contextual alternative conditions and the context independent conditions, right? So I'm wondering, you see what I'm wondering about?
Kind of.
So the item they use are only some of the animals reading, are only the rabbit and the dog reading, right? So so my question is, with only,
So they say that only didn't have an effect on either of the trial type, but they say that the children did answer. So when the word some was in the sentence, that they said yes on the 2-item true trials. So
and
if
what are the
basically
the
2-item true, this is just so fitting, basically fitting 2 of the 3 animals, the description for only 2 of the 3.
All right.
Yes, that's
So
when they said yes. So this is correct, as I understood it.
good. But when did they fail? Basically, here's what I'm not sure I understood. What was the condition in which they failed to strengthen the meaning of some, right?
I don't even know if they said anything about the sum. I think they only said.
I can hear you anymore. Sorry.
I'm not sure if they said something about the sum. I just know that they said something about the only, and that this strengthened the utterances, but only if they were provided contextually. That's what I got from the paper.
Right. So I guess so. There is another. So you showed one graph, right? So there is another graph in the paper that is actually quite informative. Can I share it? Sorry.
Stop my sharing.
Yeah, now you should see my my paper? Do you see it?
I do.
Good. So you basically showed this graph, right? Where you see the difference with respect to the condition including only and the difference without only, right? So with no only, they would fail to strengthen the meaning of the utterance, right? In the normal condition, like is Cookie Monster holding the apple and the banana, or is Cookie Monster only holding the apple and the banana, or something like this. Whereas this graph here, this one is the one that says that only didn't have any effect, right? When you apply to some. So I guess here the question was, are some of the animals reading, right? Or are only some of the animal readings? And they answered yes in 65, 67% of trials, regardless of the condition, regardless of the presence of only, right? So I guess the point is that when there were 3 animals reading, and the question was, are only some of the animals readings? A lot of children said yes, right? Do you agree? So yeah, so the point is basically that even the use of only did not basically mean the presence of only did not have any effect on strengthening the meaning of some. So they claim that it's not really about the failure of computing an implicature, even if you have a so-called grammatical exhaustification. So you have the word only, which semantically obligatorily strengthen the meaning of some as some but not all, right? Only some animals were reading means that a subset of the animals were reading, but there are some animals that were not reading, right? Still, children fail to derive this meaning. So yeah, so basically the cool thing is to compare this graph here, right, where only actually worked, with this graph here where only didn't have any effect in the test items, right? Do you agree, Susanna?
Yes, I think I'm going to do that in the paper that we have to send to you. That's what I wanted to do.
Yeah,
anyway,
I mean, your presentation was fine. It's just I wanted to make sure that I understood exactly, where they failed basically, and that's exactly in this kind of condition, right? Did you guys understand? So the point is that, yeah, so it's not about not being able to derive the implicature when there is no overt exotification, but it's really, when there is no overt exotification, but it's really about not being able to basically restrict the meaning of some to a stronger interpretation, whether or not there is an overt only, basically. Okay. Did you guys understand? I don't see any thumbs. Yes, Alexandra, Bernadette. Okay, good. Okay, so yeah, one more puzzling point added to our set of papers. Okay. Yeah, so if we buy these results, it suggests that it's so that what they want to push, the idea what they want to push was that it's the struggle is really about to access the alternatives, no matter what kind of scalar trigger you have, whether you have an implicit covert trigger like just some, or whether you have an explicit exhaustifier like only. Okay. But this is not general. They would do it when they have to compute the so-called exhaustification inferences or ad hoc inferences, right? When you see, I don't know, I ate a candy and a cake, and there is a third salient element. But when they have apply only to some, then they have problems. Now, if I may add some sort of critique to this experiment, to me, the question including only is a little bit weird. I mean, not weird, but kind of complex to understand. It's quite complex, right? To ask, are only some of the animals reading? To me, is a little bit tricky. And another problem with only, when you have overt only, is that only is scopally ambiguous. So a question like, are only some of the animals reading? Okay, could mean, are only some of the animals or all of them reading? But it could mean other stuff, like, I mean, I'm not sure if you can actually change the scope of only in a question like this. But in principle, only could have a scope on reading or a scope on animals, or different scope. So then it would mean something like, no, also some of the boys are reading, or some of the animals are only reading. No, they are also doing something else. Okay, so this kind of scope ambiguity might sort of mess up with the results of the experiment. Basically, that would be one of the critiques that I would have. Do you share my feeling that a question like, are only some of the animals reading, is a little bit complex to understand?
Yes, I think for the children, I mean, if someone asked me a question like that, I think it wouldn't be that complicated, but I think for 4-year-olds, yes, it is complicated.
Right.
For them to understand. I think it's kind of a little bit unfair. I don't know.
Right. Also, usually you would put the critical word in a statement that you're testing, right? If you put it in a question, I don't know. I mean, it feels to me a little bit strange.
I mean, honestly, I liked the paper, but I did find it kind of a little bit confusing, to be honest. That's why I tried to make it as understandable as possible, and that's why I had to include so many things. Yeah.
So there might be also, the difference between the two experiments might just be the fact that it's simpler to understand a sentence like, did only the bear and the cat read a book or whatever, compared to having to compute the scope and the meaning of only some in a question, right? And also maybe, if you have to choose between only and just, maybe, I don't know, maybe just is more is more frequent in child speed. So yeah, but yeah, cool. Thanks a lot. Is there any other question or comment related to this paper, or can we move on? I guess we can move on then to Hong Hao, I would say.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. Can you see the screen?
Yes.
All right, that's great. So the presentation I'll be doing on is a paper called The Children's Comprehension of Plural Predicate Conjunction, and it's by Tu in 2017. So this is the table of contents. They did 2 experiments along with an introduction and a discussion. So in the introduction, they said that sentences containing plural definite subject noun phrases and conjoined predicates appear to give rise to 2 possible readings, a Boolean or a weaker split interpretation. So another way to look at it is, and the way they phrased it in the paper itself was, you could have a stronger or a weaker interpretation of a sentence. For example, if you look at a sentence like the bears are big and white, you could view the sentence as saying the bears are both big and white. If you look at a sentence like the bears are big and small, you could say that some of the bears are big and some of them are small.
Yeah. Can I just say something? So in the literature, like in linguistic literature, another terminology to refer to this reading is distributive reading for the stronger reading, right? Which means that each element the predicates have to be true for each element, or the cumulative reading for the weaker one. So you basically say, okay, some of them can be big and some of them can be white, and if you put everything together, they're big and white. Yeah. So just to tell you, if you encounter this other terminology, they kind of mean the same thing in this respect.
Okay.
Yeah.
So one of the hypotheses they bring up in their paper is the extended strongest meaning hypothesis, and this is kind of what they base a lot of their experiment around, which is that it uses the strongest truth condition from its basic universal meaning that are not contradicted by known properties of the single predicates. So this means that it takes, if B means that A cannot exist, then A is the answer. So for example, you look at this picture here, there's two sentences that could describe it. One is that the ducks are swimming and flying, or that the ducks are swimming and quacking. The second sentence would not be able to apply to this picture because of this hypothesis, because it contradicts the thing, which means that, it can't be swimming and flying at the same time, unless there's like two different sets of ducks. So the next hypothesis that they bring up is the maximum typicality hypothesis, which is that it's less typical for two predicates to apply simultaneously to each individual in the plural subject. And the more accessible the weaker interpretation becomes. So this means that if it's a very untypical sentence, the more accessible the weaker interpretation becomes. And then they go on to talk about the flexibility of and in the ideas of children, because no studies have examined children's sensitivity to the flexibility of and the existing data does not provide the full picture of children's knowledge of semantics of conjunction, and it's not clear what predictions should be made. So in experiment one is a 2x2 design, and adults and children are the between subject factor, and the compatibility of the conjoined predicates are the within subject factor. It had 26 English-speaking children who scored 75% accuracy on control and filler trials. And the procedure used a truth value judgment task, where participants were presented with a series of cartoon pictures, video clips of a puppet describing the set of objects. And the participants' task was to decide whether the puppet's description was right or wrong. And they also had to give a follow-up justification after. So Ellie, which was the name of the puppet, they would have to say, why was Ellie wrong, or how do you know Ellie was right? And this will be asked by the experimenter. And the materials given were like 2 training items, which were simple true-false statements to familiarize the participants with the task. And they then received a randomized sequence of 4 target items, 8 control items, and 4 filler items. So the control items and the filler items were basically there to make sure that the target items is to minimize any confounds. That's the whole point of those items. Whereas the 4 target items are what you really wanted to look at. And it was presented in 2 orders. One was the reverse of the other to sort of minimize any more confounds as well. Adjectives A and B were considered incompatible if being A entailed B being not B. So what this means that being big entails being not small, and being small entails being not big. So something along those lines. So if you're hot, you can't be cold. If you're cold, you can't be hot. So this is an example of some of the incompatible sentences that was given to the children as a trial. So they had a context of 2 big brown bears and 2 small white bears in a picture, and then it's incompatible because the bears are big and small. And the target answer for this is, ideally, the correct answer would be no, they can't be big and small at the same time. And so on and so forth for the rest of them. So this was one of the examples. The experimenter would say, oh, what a beautiful day, look at all the bears on the mountainside. He would say this to the child, and he would say to the puppet, which would be a pre-recorded video, saying, can you tell us something about the bears? Then the puppet would say, the bears are big and small. Or if it's in a compatible condition, the puppet would say, the bears are big and white. And then the child would have to figure out, was that correct or wrong? So both groups displayed 93% accuracy across various control and failure conditions, and participants were consistent in their responses, either accepting or rejecting at least 3 or 4 targets. And children and adults gave similar justifications in their post-experimental, when they were asked to give a justification after. So in summary, for experiment 1, children's responses did not differ significantly from those of adults in either condition. And 2 of the 11 adults and 1 of the 10 children in compatible condition consistently accepted the target sentences, apparently accessing the weak reading. Now in experiment 2, the goal was if children would be adult-like in their interpretation of sentential coordination equivalence of the predicate conjunctions. This means that would they behave the same way as adults would, looking at sentence in a different kind of sentence, basically. And they also wanted to investigate a reference shift behind the acceptability of incompatible targets. So basically, what they were going to do, they were going to shift the sentences from stuff like the bears are big and small to the bears are big and the bears are small, and see if like there's a reference shift between, or if there's an unconscious reference shift naturally in the kids' thinking from the first sentence to the second sentence. So what they had to do was try and deal with a lot of the confounds because they had a lot of practical constraints. And because all their child participants had already gone through experiment 1. To mitigate this, they had a time gap and ensured a suitable time period had elapsed between experiments. On average, this meant like 3 weeks. The puppet participating in the task was also changed from Ellie the elephant to Rafi the giraffe. And this made the children want to participate more because it was seen as like a sort of new task. They also counterbalanced which condition the children had seen in experiment 1. So if in the earlier first experiment, the children participated in the compatible condition, they would now be put in the incompatible condition. So this prevented any sort of like repeat confounds. They did a similar truth value judgment task, which is largely the same experiment 1. And target and control sentences were modified minimally to contain sentential rather than phrasal conjunctions, because they only wanted to look at the difference between how they see the conjunctions. And only the 4 singular conjunctionless filler sentences remained unchanged. So this is an example of how much they changed, which as you can see is not very much. So if you look at the first one, it's like 2 big brown bears, 2 small white bears. That's the context. The bears are big and small. If you look at experiment 2, they changed it to a sentential one. The bears are big and the bears are small. But they still wanted to see if they had the same answer, which was that it's sort of wrong. And the results showed that the percentage of yes responses was really high, and it was indicative of weak readings, while no responses were indicative of strong readings. All participants were generally consistent in their responses, either accepting or rejecting at least 3 or 4 targets. So in their discussion, they also talked about how the 4-year-old participants in the study was really adult-like in their comprehension of phrasal and sentential predicate conjunctions. Both children and adults allowed a weaker non-Boolean reading of incompatible predicate conjunctions and favored the stronger intersective reading of compatible predicate conjunctions. For common adjectives that are frequent and familiar to 4-year-olds, these children could have accumulated enough world knowledge to decide whether a conjunction is possible. For example, it's not possible to ascribe to an individual the property of being both big and small. But it also presented a new puzzle, which was that the lack of a difference between responses to phrasal and sentential incompatible targets is compatible with the maximal typicality hypothesis, but does not conform to the predictions of the ESMH. And that's it for my presentation.
Okay, thank you very much. Was very clear, very clear. Yeah, it's interesting. So this is a topic that we haven't really talked about, right? So the ambiguity of VP conjunction, right? And yeah, and you know, it's bears a lot of similarity with all the topics that we talked about, like scope ambiguity and quantifier ambiguity, and yeah, and there's another interesting issue that we haven't really talked about a lot, which is the strongest meaning hypothesis, right? So according to Crane, for instance, for children, like so he called it the subset principle. So children would first learn the strongest meaning of a quantifier or a construction, because it's the most it's basically I mean, in a way, it's a safer way to learn the meaning of something in order to rule out the highest number of contexts that would be false with the strongest meaning, right? And then during their learning path, they would sort of learn to weaken this interpretation and to be more, let's say, less restrictive in their semantics interpretation of these terms. But so one of the problem of the strongest meaning hypothesis, which would work for stuff like surface and inverse scope reading, right, of universal quantifier and negation, because there the surface scope is stronger than the inverse scope interpretation, right? But that wouldn't work for the implicature cases. So the whole data about implicatures, where children actually adopt a weaker meaning, speaks against the stronger meaning hypothesis, right? And it's interesting to see also that these data that you showed are also speaking against the strongest meaning hypothesis, because in fact children are able to adopt this cumulative reading of conjunction, right?
Yeah.
So yeah. Cool. Thanks so much. I mean, we also run an experiment with the same methodology that I showed you for the inverse scope experiments and the indirect implicator experiments with the VP conjunction. So I don't have a real presentation, but I have a poster. So if you guys are interested in this topic, and if we have time, I could show you a little bit what we found quickly with the poster. But you know, it's up to you. So do you want to hear more about this topic, or you're fine even without knowing more about this topic? Please cast your vote. If you want to hear more, if you want me to show you our poster quickly, raise your thumb. Otherwise, don't do anything. Okay, cool. So I see a few thumbs up. So,
it's not the poster that I spilled beer on, right?
Sorry, it's not the poster?
It's not the poster that I spilled beer on in Moscow, right? That was a different poster.
I think, no, I think I didn't present it in Moscow. I think I presented it in Cagliari.
Okay, good.
The one with the surfing, the one with the surfing seals.
Okay, I haven't seen it. Okay.
Oh, good. Okay, so let's do this. Let's have like a 5 minutes break, okay? So I find the poster, and then I will briefly show you the poster and what we found, which is nice because we also have some nice online data, and then we have our last presentation by Gergana and her colleague. Okay. And we should be, and that should be it, right? There's no one else who has to present today, correct? Correct. Okay, so whatever. Okay, so you see the poster now?
Mm-hmm.
Good. Can you read stuff? Okay. So, you know, the topic is exactly the same as the one that has been just introduced by Hong Hao. So the idea is that there are like some different theories about VP conjunction, okay? So VP conjunction is the idea that I mean, is what happens when you conjoin two VPs, like in sentences like, the 6 seals are swimming and wearing hats, okay? So it's exactly the same problem that we have seen in the last presentation. And to give you some background, there are a few theories that make different claims with respect to VP conjunction. So one is the one by Champollion and Winter, which suggests that conjunction has a distributive interpretation. So it has the strongest meaning, right? So you see that here, P and Q. So for every individual, it must be both true that P applies to the individual and Q applies to the individual. So let's take an example. The 6 seals are swimming and wearing hats, right? So if I zoom on this picture, you see that all these seals are swimming, but these 6 seals here are swimming with a hat, basically. So this would be a context making the distributive interpretation true, okay? Because all the 6 of them are doing both things. They're satisfying both predicates. Whereas these guys here, they are birded seals, right? But they are swimming, but they are not wearing hats, okay?
I was wondering if these are beards or just they look like you.
Well, I don't know. It's up to you. Up to you to decide. Right. But, you know, if you have a non-distributive interpretation or a cumulative reading, or however you want to call it, then according to Haycock and Zamparelli and Krivka, this is more like the real meaning of VP disjunction, conjunction, right? And this means like something like, for every individual, there is at least an individual Y, such that the sum of Y and Z is basically satisfying the predicate. So, I mean, I don't know exactly how to read this formula, but it basically says that if a few of the individuals are satisfying one predicate and other individuals are satisfying the other predicates, if you take the sum of all these individuals, if it is true that at least some of them are satisfying one and some of them are satisfying the other, then you're good, right? Is this kind of okay, Yasu? I always had problem at reading this stuff. So the important part is basically this sum operator here, which led you to consider the sum of all the individuals. And within that group, at least some of them must have done one thing and some of them must have done the other thing, okay? So again, this is weaker. So every time that the distributive interpretation is true, the non-distributive interpretation is also true. So this would be a limit case of the distributive interpretation, whereas here again, it's false, because these guys are only swimming. No one of these is wearing a hat. So there should be at least one of these seals wearing a hat to make this true, okay? Good. But if you look at this scenario here, right, where the 6 seals are swimming and surfing, right? So swimming and surfing here are two disjoint predicates or non-compatible predicates, adopting the previous terminology, right? So you cannot be swimming and surfing at the same time. Either you're swimming or you're surfing. So this would be true under the cumulative or non-distributive reading, right? The distributive reading cannot be true because there cannot be an event in which you're doing both things, okay? So the distributive reading would be false. The cumulative reading would be true in this context, but not in this one, because here some of them are swimming and some of them are snorkeling or whatever, but no one is surfing. No seal is surfing, okay? Right, so we had this distributive scenario where one of the contexts is true under the distributive reading, and then under the non-distributive reading, we have a cumulative scenario where we had the disjoint predicates, which force the distributive reading to be false because they're incompatible. So only the cumulative reading could be true. So if you accept this one, it means that you are fine with the weaker reading, just like in the previous experiment we saw. And then we have a third condition where we have a cumulative scenario, right? With non-disjoint predicate. So this is cool because this is sort of testing the idea that sometimes, like made some claim by some people, that you only adopt a weaker reading if you are forced by the property of the predicate. So if you are predicate, and this is also some sort of like the prototypicality hypothesis, right? So if your predicate is prototypically cumulative, then it might lead you to adopt a weaker interpretation, okay? So here the predicate is non-disjoint, so there's nothing telling you that you could not have a distributive interpretation. So if the non-distributive interpretation is just an exceptional thing that you would do in certain cases, then you should not be very happy with this, okay? Because here is the 6 seals are swimming and wearing hats. So there's nothing preventing you from doing both things at the same time, right? But here you see the typical scenario only true in a cumulative reading, because 3 of them are wearing a hat and not swimming, and 3 of them are swimming and not wearing a hat. Whereas these guys, some of them are swimming and some of them again have a beard, okay? So this was important to test the hypothesis that you would only get the weaker reading if you're forced to do so, okay? So if we come back to our theory, some experimental evidence found that the non-distributive interpretation is more difficult in children. So that again, children would like the strongest interpretation, okay? So the questions we asked were like, okay, how do the semantic properties of the predicate and the context contribute to the final interpretation and the online processing? Because we did this with eye tracking, like the previous experiments. The second question is, which readings are available and which are preferred and which are easy to process? So exactly the kind of question that we asked for inverse scope. And the third question is, how do children and adults differ in their interpretation, okay, and processing? And there are at least 3 hypotheses that we sort of sketched out with this beautiful diagram. So one is that non-distributive readings are out. You only have the strongest reading of conjunction, okay? And Winter claimed that in 2001. So only in condition 1, where you can actually use your distributive interpretation to select this scenario, you should be happy. And here you should be non-happy, okay? So you cannot adopt the cumulative reading. Then there is another hypothesis, which is actually supported by previous experimental research, which says that it is not true that you're not able to adopt a cumulative reading. You can, right? Sorry, a non-distributive reading, a weaker reading. You can do it, but only if you are forced to do so, for instance, by the property of the predicate. So non-distributive readings are exceptional. If you can, go for the strongest one. And that would tell you that in condition 2, where you're forced to choose the cumulative scenario, you might struggle a little bit, okay? So for instance, you might take more time to identify the scenario because you have to do some exception operation. But then again, in condition 3, where the predicate does not force you to pick a non-distributive reading, you should not be happy. And then you have a third reading which says, no, non-distributive reading, sorry, a third hypothesis that says non-distributive readings are not exceptional, okay? VP conjunction is ambiguous, systematically ambiguous for some reason between a stronger and a weaker interpretation, just like implicatures, just like inverse scope, surface scope configurations, okay? Scope shift. So if this is true, then people should be completely fine here, but also completely fine here. And then who knows what they're gonna do in this condition, okay? Is this clear? Is there anything that is not clear? Anything that you want to ask? Okay, so let's go to the results. Offline results. So this is about the preference choice, okay? So what happens is that adults, so again, the task was to choose the context that would provide the best fit for the sentence you heard, okay? So the context that would provide the best description for which the sentence would be the best description, or reject both if both contexts are not fine, okay? So what we found is that the adults are super happy with condition 1 and condition 2, and they have a lot of rejection in condition 3, okay? So they're completely fine at adopting a distributive or non-distributive reading and selecting this one, so no surprise. But they are also fine at adopting a weaker interpretation of conjunction when they have this cumulative scenario with disjoint predicate, okay? So it was like the small and the big bear, exactly the same kind of example, and they're fine, cool. But they're not very fine with this. So when the predicate allows a stronger reading, you actually want to adopt it. And you're not happy when a scenario does not display a situation that is compatible with the distributive reading, okay? So here, when they read the 6 seals are swimming and wearing hats, they probably interpret this sentence as 6 seals are swimming while wearing a hat. And then when they found these scenarios, they're like, oh, but this is not really nice, okay? So the critical thing is that these scenarios display exactly the same properties, right? So you always have, in this scenario here, 3 of the seals doing one thing and 3 other seals doing the other thing, okay? These are surfing, these are swimming. These are swimming and these are wearing a hat. But here, you are completely fine. And here, you are not, okay? So this already tells us something about the relationship between the predicate and the interpretation of conjunction. And this was the adults. What about the children? Very, very, very similar results, okay? A little bit of more mistakes, but very, very beautiful results. But you see, they accept this condition, this scenario and this condition more often. So they reject a little bit less often, okay? Which again might tell you something that in general children are a little bit more tolerant about certain violations due to ambiguity of interpreting critical terms, okay? Cool. So adults and children accept distributive interpretation in distributive scenarios, non-distributive interpretation in cumulative scenarios with disjoint predicates, with incompatible predicates, and they both accept less often weaker readings of conjunction in cumulative scenarios that would allow you to adopt a distributive reading, a stronger reading, okay? And also we had a preference condition that I haven't showed you, and they both strongly prefer distributive readings over non-distributive ones. You see, this was exactly like in the inverse code. So we just compared, we compared this kind of context to this kind of context, and they all preferred the distributive reading, the stronger reading, even children. So this is actually cool. Good. So they basically kind of behave the same. What's going to happen in online data? What's going to happen with respect to their eye movements? Okay. So what we might expect is that in this condition, everyone is a little bit puzzled. Everyone is a little bit like, what's going on? But what we are really interested in also is what happens in this condition. Is there going to be a difference between the acceptance, the identification of the scenario when you adopt a stronger meaning of conjunction compared to the identification of this scenario when you adopt a weaker meaning. And why do we expect the difference? Because if the weaker meaning of conjunction, if the non-distributive meaning, it requires some sort of revision, some sort of rethinking, then this is expected to be more difficult to identify, more difficult to process, and involve a delay, okay? We cannot compare directly these conditions because these are different sentences, but we can kind of see what's going to happen here. And I'm going to tell you what happens. Let me just jump to, okay, so first of all, condition 1, this is again the target preference, okay? So when this line departs from chance, then it means that you identified the right target. And this is adults versus children, and you see almost no difference. It's very, very beautiful data, okay? So these were, again, elementary school children, 6 to 10 years old. They behave exactly like adults. Beautiful. Now, what happens in condition 2? Super fast. In fact, they were even faster than in condition 1. So, we cannot really compare condition 1 to condition 2 directly, but looking at this, we see that there is no indication of any delay or any struggle at adopting a non-distributive reading. And also very, very difference between adults and children. This is not even significant, and this is mildly significant. So they are completely fine with non-distributive reading if the predicate forces you to adopt it, okay? Now let's see what happens in condition 3. So condition 3 is, again, when you have a cumulative scenario suggesting a weaker reading, requiring a weaker reading to be accepted, but adopting a comparable predicate, okay? So 6 seals are swimming and wearing hats, okay? Compared to the 6 seals are swimming and wearing hats, okay? So here you have your distributive scenario, and here you have your cumulative scenario. And we are going to compare what happens in this condition, how fast are you at identifying this scenario in this condition, compared to how fast are you at preferring this scenario compared to this one. And remember that in the offline in the offline data, they were not super happy with this scenario, okay? So what happens is that you get a delay. With the adults, you see, this is your identification or preference for the true scenario. And here the sentences were exactly the same, so we could compare the condition directly. And you see that you have this nice delay in condition 3, okay? Beautiful. But then you might say, yes, the scenarios were different, the pictures were different, whatever. So we are not completely sure that this difference is really about reinterpreting the meaning of conjunction, okay? It might be also that difference in the scenario plays a role, but what we can do is to compare this difference to what the children do, okay? So you remember children were as fast as adults in condition 1. What are they going to do in condition 3? Boom, mega delay, okay? So this tells us that probably this condition requires some sort of revision, and that children struggle more at doing this revision. So at switching from a stronger meaning of conjunction to a weaker meaning. And if you compare adults and children in condition 3, here's a difference, okay? So the beauty of these results is that the only difference between adults and children in the online data was in this condition, where the predicate would allow a distributive strong reading of conjunction, but the only possible interpretation that would match this scenario was the weaker one. So you had to weaken probably the first interpretation that you adopted, so to have the revision, and then children took more time, okay? So yeah, so to conclude, relation to our question, right? Non-distributive readings are not exceptional, okay, and are not harder to process because everyone was super fast. And the initial interpretation is determined by the semantic property of the predicate. So over the visual context. So it is the strongest meanings hypothesis. If the strongest meaning is compatible with the predicate, then you go for that. So in a way, it's a sort of a weakened version of the strongest meaning hypothesis, okay? Why? Because if the context does not support your early commitment about the strongest meaning, then you need to do a revision. And then we know that children are slower at revising their initial commitment, okay? Is this clear? Does it make sense? Do you have any question? Did you like it? Good. So I think this was a nice follow-up on our presentation. And now let's really go to our very last presentation of the class. So
here I am. I hope I'm gonna be able to. I hope everyone can hear me well. Unfortunately, my microphone is not here, so I'm using the one from the computer.
It's fine, completely fine.
Okay, thank you. And now, how do I?
Just
Bildschirmvrij.
Yeah.
I guess meaning share screen. Yeah.
Yeah.
Desktop 1, I guess.
You can also share just the file of the presentation if you want.
Well, I think I already did the other one, so is it happening?
Perfect.
Okay, great. So Eva did, as you suggested, some recordings of the part she has had to do for the experiment, and yes, we make a review of this work.
Sorry again. So are you gonna play the recording or you will present your part?
She did it inside of the presentation, so I'm gonna play her recording.
Beautiful, thank you.
Yeah.
Nice. Okay.
The following work has been done in 2012, which means there must be a lot of work done after that and a lot of development of the matter. The work itself works with all other experiments done before by changing a little bit of the experimental design and focusing mainly on developmental and methodological issues in the way children are able to infer scalar implicatures and using the scalar quantifier sum. There are 6 experiments here that are going to be shown, and actually, since there's really a lot of work that one has to know in order to present the results in the best way, we decided to leave our focus on the associations we made after reading the paper, which actually we did a discussion for almost all the time. Okay, so one of the first association I made while listening to all the other interpretations is this video I'm going to play for you. It's not exactly showing the development of scalar implicatures by children, but it shows the way they tend to take things literally and not really very good in deriving pragmatical expressions. I'm just gonna play this short video. It's also to oh, no, sorry. How do I? Okay.
All right, ready, set, swing it. There it is. Keep your eye on the ball. Try again. Eye on the ball. Swing. Eye on the ball. Yeah, let's go.
Yes, so children tend to take things literally, even when it comes up to such a simple, to us adults, it's a simple net explanation, simple sentence, but yeah, they need to develop a specific knowledge, and their lexicon should mature in order for them to understand hidden meanings. So the goal of the study, with comparison to the previous studies, is to answer the question of how and when this development takes place, and how do children in different ages derive pragmatic inferences associated with the scalar quantifier sum. Comparing it with the methodological issues of the previous studies, and they keep the methods in these experiments same in all age groups, between all age groups. And the main point is to establish in what extent children in different ages are able to infer scalar implicatures, because the results from previous studies shows that children as from age of 6 are adult-like in deriving the scalar implicature. The child we saw is not more than 3 or 4 years old, and yeah, we saw how they react. So I'm gonna play the first experiment that Eva is presenting.
Have been showing that the performance of children color and scholar in texture depends on their age, their language, and the task and the methodology they were presented with.
We can't hear very well. Can you turn on the volume?
Okay, does it depend on my computer or yeah?
No, I think you have to turn up that volume there.
That's
yeah.
It's maximum actually.
Uh.
That's not the volume. That's the duration. If I turn, how about this?
Yeah.
The first experiment of the study is to measure actually the developmental effect of scalar implicature, how they show up, and when they show up, and why kids behave differently from adults. So this first experiment consisted of 63 Italian children aged from 4 to 7 years old, and they were compared to 12 adults. The experiment that they used was the truth value judgment task. It consisted of 11 short stories acted out with toys. At the end of each story, a puppet had to describe in one sentence what had happened in the short story. And then the subject was asked to judge if the puppet said the sentence well or badly. And if the answer was badly, the participant had to say why, what was wrong with the sentence, and how could have been corrected in order to improve the language. An example I can give you is, for example, the sentence of the puppet could have been, some Smurf went on a boat, in a context where, for example, 3 out of 3 Smurfs went on a boat, and where the word all instead of some could have been used. And what they found was very interesting. As we can see on the table that will show up on a click, we see that there is quite a difference between 4 and 5 years old, and then 6, 7 years old and adults. So 6 and 7 years old behave much, much similarly like adults than 4 and 5 years old. And we will be discussing at the end why we think this phenomenon is happening at this age. But for now, the second conclusion that the experimenters concluded is that whenever 6 and 7 years old were correcting the sentence by the puppet, they were always using the strongest term in the scale, which is all instead of some, which means that they completely understand. They completely rejected the under-informative sentence, and they were able to justify, understand, and say why it was a bad sentence.
Okay, that was the first experiment. Now we go to the second one, which again Eva presents.
Now on to the second experiment. Before actually telling you the method that the scientists used, I would like to explain a little bit of theory in order to understand better. So in Italian, since the children were all Italian, in Italian there's the word qualche, which refers to the English version of some, and which is a qualifier, and then you also have alcuni dei, which is referring to the English version of some of, and which is a partitive. For those who are not familiar with the word partitive, it simply means a part of something coming from a whole. So the experiment was designed exactly the same way as the first experiment, however, with the only difference that instead of using the quantifier, they used the partitive. And the goal was actually to help children focus more on the set of characters that they need to consider, and therefore increase the probability that they will reject the under-informative description. The results were actually quite surprising. There was actually an absence of any improvement between the first and the second experiment. So therefore, the children were not helped by the partitive construction form, and they couldn't better and more often reject the underperformative description.
Okay, and up to the third experiment, last one by Eva.
So before jumping into the third experiment itself, I would still need to mention that in order to represent the lexicon of the Scalar implicature, there's two components. So you have the basic meaning, which is basically the hearer who hears and thinks about the word some, and then represents it in their lexicon. And then the second part, you have the scale, which is the hearer who acknowledges the fact that the speaker could have used all instead of some, and then decides between which one to use. So onto the experiment itself. So basically it was conducted the same way as the first experiment, but this time no comparison with adults. And one other difference is that the stories were actually performed live. I don't know if it's worth mentioning it or if it creates a difference, but the stories were performed live. And it was once again the same as the first experiments, where puppets were acting, and the experimenter had to judge if the sentence said by the puppet was said correctly or badly. But this time there was two components. The first of all, the puppet said a sentence containing all, and then the second part was the same sentence but said with the sentence with the word some. And once again, the child had to evaluate the puppet statement. The results were actually pretty much the same as the.
Excuse me, I already interrupted it, so I'm not going to play it again. I think it's not going to begin from the same point. Well, the results didn't change much compared to the other study, which means that's not the most deciding factor. We move on to the fourth experiment, where the same 24 5-year-old participants in second experiment took part, and all of them actually failed to in the conversation violation. They did a conversation violation test in which the examples are not following the maxim of Grice. In the given example here, we see a violation of the maxim of quantity. The 3 dolls are using a laptop. Participants are being shown 25 short conversations among 3 dolls. One of them is asking a question, and the other 2 give answers. One of them violates the conversation of one of the conversation maxims, and the other one doesn't. Particularly in this example, the doll 1 asks, "What did you have for lunch?" Doll 2 answers some food, which is underinformative and thus violates the maxim. The other doll says a pizza, which gives the entire information needed, and that's the informative answer. And compared to the truth value judgment task in experiment 2, this time most of the children get the answers right. 17 of 25 correct on conversation violation test. And it means the children have to say which they had to answer which doll gives a better answer and which one says something silly or rude, depending on the maxim that is being investigated. So it showed that they did much better. So it means they have the sensibility of hearing when the maxims are violated, even though they're not sensitive. They didn't do well in the truth value test in the first 3 experiments. So they have the ability to detect the conversation norms, and so in the experiment 5, it's also similar to the experiment 2, to experiment 1 we showed before, and this time children they're trying to be made aware of the fact that first of them, there is a comparison with the overregularization by when children learn the irregular verbs. First, they follow the principle of the regular verbs. For example, if they want to form the past form of the verb sit, they would say sitted. And at some point, after a particular age, with the so-called phase of maturation, they learn to imply, not to over-regularize, but to imply the rule of exception. So in this particular experiment, 17 of the children that take the truth value judgment task in experiment 1 and failed to derive the scalar implicature associated with some, they were shown, the experiment that Eva showed with Qualte und Alcunidae. In this case, children are always shown examples in which the right answer, the more appropriate answer, should be all and not some. Like in this case, we see that all of the chipmunks are taking a shower, and an answer like some of them are taking a shower would be weak in the context and uninformative, not informative enough. The results showed that actually this time, we saw that in the first test, actually they had a poor performance. And this time, more than 25% of all the children gave the right answer. So this had to mean that children, it does not prove that children can derive scalar implicatures, but they're sensitive of the maximum of quantity. And yeah. In experiment 6, I must say, this time I had a bit of difficulties because we only see the example, this example is shown where children have to again choose between the appropriate for of all and some of, in case where when all the carrots have been picked up, it's correct to say that all have been picked up. And in the case where it's not correct, it's not right to say that some have been picked up when all of them have. And also it's not correct to say all of them have been picked up when only a few of them have been. So what I don't understand here actually is how do we see the use of sum of in Italian in Italian language between subject and object position. I mean, that's not given, that's not shown in the example because that's the only example we actually see. And in this case, this is in object position, I guess. Yeah.
I don't remember exactly the experiment, but I guess you could say some of the carrots were picked, or some of the carrots are on the table. So there are several tricks you could use to switch the quantifier from the object to the subject position, right?
Yeah. Well, in this case, we have this example, and the results compared to the previous study by the same paper was that there are also adults taking part in the experiment, 40 adults and 40 children. It's not surprised that 100% of the adults gave the right responses, while children this time performed also 90% correct of the whole by giving the right answer, which is more appropriate in which case. All carrots or some carrots in this case, and of course all carrots as not appropriate for this case, but some. So the main finding of this sixth experiment is actually that children, they are aware in somehow of the ambiguity of some between the basic meaning. They just cannot, and the stronger meaning, some but not all, they just cannot derive it by themselves. And this is while this trying to discuss and to decipher the whole paper, this is like the main points we got through while discussing. Let's say the blue ones are more or less mine, and the orange ones are for Eva's. I'm gonna play them.
Yeah, let me just stress one thing. If you can go back to the previous slide, right? So the critical manipulation that maybe you're gonna say that again, but I just wanna make sure that everyone is on the same page. The critical manipulation that improved children performance was to show them the trial where all was wrong, right? So the trial where both the trials where all was appropriate, was true in this kind of context, right, in the upper context, and also the trials where all was false in a subset context. So somehow this made them salient the more appropriateness of using some for an implicature supporting context, right? So it was really the presentation of the all false situation that somehow led them to improve their pragmatic performance with some, right? So this was specifically the critical manipulation that they added in this experiment, right?
Well, I think that's my own main difficulty in understanding how a sentence like some children ate spaghetti for lunch evokes an alternative all of them eat. I mean, we discussed it with Eva a lot. I mean, I think she gets it better than I do. Mm-hmm. I just don't, maybe it's a language matter. My mother tongue is Bulgarian. And for me, if I hear all, it means like all. All, if I hear some of them, mm-hmm. it cannot mean all to me. I mean, mm-hmm. particularly to me. Mm-hmm. We had a sort of discussion. She gave me this example. Like if you have a herd of elephants, we take 5 of them and we say some elephants are mammals. Mm-hmm. It could be true if we just know that we have taken those particularly 5 out of the whole 100, let's say. But still, if I say some elements are mammals, to me, it doesn't make sense because all of them are, no matter if we just take the 5 particular or...
I see that.
Yeah.
What I wanted to stress is that in this experiment, the manipulation that improved children's performance with SAM was showing them the all false context. So we don't know exactly why, right? But the manipulation that worked was to show them the all false context before. That was the critical aspect of this experiment. Okay, that's the most important part of this whole paper. That for some reason, when they saw the all false items before the SAM items, then they were sort of facilitated to derive the scalar implicature. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry for interrupting you.
No, please. Thank you actually for having done this, because I feel when I get lost in my own explanation of things, I honestly say I'm not really getting. Maybe I should have let her do that, but it was too late to change what we have already done. But yeah,
I'm not explaining, you know, what whatever the interpretation or whatever. I'm just highlighting their main result. Okay, that's the main result of this particular experiment, and the manipulation that managed to improve their performance with SAM was to show them, for some crazy reason that we haven't really understood, the all false trials before, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So please go on. Sorry.
This is actually the last one, the last page, in which we decided to, so let's say, set ground for our paper we have to write, which has to show our own interpretations and associations while working on the paper. And one of the first one I had was like similar to the video we saw. Like the way there is a critical period for language acquisition exists, yeah, right. That's one of the hypotheses. Maybe in the same critical period, it also applies for pragmatic acquisition, meaning that in this critical period, it's said that connection in children's brain are not explicitly made. They're just not connected. The neurons in children's brain, and after age of 4 or 5 years old, they start making connection. I mean, they're connected, and they start to work more automatically, more synchronized, and yeah, the children are able to let's say dig into the pool of knowledge they have already gained in a more connected way. That was just one of the things that I associated, and by discussing this with Eva. Okay, maybe I should not play that yet. That was her response to that, but I'm going to play it to the end. The next thing I was wondering, because we mostly see, we were seeing is results with Italian children, and other papers were also showing German speaking children, some of them monolingual, some of them bilingual. And maybe, does it mean that a different language would give a different result? Like similar to the way we also discussed it here in class, that some languages, for example, German, have this way of separating the must thing. Like if I say I must, it means I am the one who is making myself do the task. And if I say in English, I have to, that means someone else is making me do it. Similar as in German, ich soll und ich muss. Und maybe, does it mean that a different language where these particular experiments are done would give different results? I guess after 2012, where our study took place, there is an answer to this question, if it's even related. But
not really, right? So we don't know yet. So it's a very good question, but I don't think we have answered that yet.
It was just about the association. We saw it's not, at least me, I'm not really following all of the examples, particularly this, some and all. But yeah, that made me think that maybe it has something to do with the languages or mother tongue, who knows. Second, point 2 and point 3 are kind of connected. Does it make a difference, or bilingual or multilingual children should show better results, since they're just prone to more language material, if I am allowed to say so? That was the third question that arose, and not to speak in name of Eva, I'm just going to play hers. It's not going to take well. Just I have to take so you hear better. Just a second. Last one.
So why do you believe that there is a gap between the age of 5 and 6 simply because children are not there yet? They're not able to process the skull implicture, and they're not able to produce it as well. It's maybe comparable to walking. Everyone has an age for it, and it just follows a logical a logical way, a timetable, a timeline. Yeah, exactly, a timeline. And we also believe that the more you work with children and the more you talk to them, you put them into situation, explain things, make them discover that will maybe make them realize color implicature much faster than other children that were not that adults were not working with them. And this is all what this experiment is all about, to give children a chance.
Yes. So actually, that was it.
Okay, thanks a lot also for the own thoughts and reflections. That was very much appreciated. Thanks so much for the great work. Yeah, I mean, if I can add something to this, I would say that, yes, these are all reasonable hypotheses that have been proposed also in the previous years, right? The problem is that these would still not answer the question of why, in certain contexts, children's performance with scalar implicatures is improved, right? So why it seems to be enough to provide them with, for instance, with some all false trial before the critical trial to improve their performance. Or if you remember in Skordos and Papafrago experiment, why contextual manipulation could make their performance with scalar implicature better. Another question is, considering our results on indirect scalar implicatures, why does it seem that children are better with indirect scalar implicature than scalar implicatures? Why are children better with different, for instance, with ad hoc implicatures than with the implicatures derived by sum? So, all these questions are still on the table. And of course, we know that there are a lot of factors that come into play, right? Pragmatics, facilitation, as you say, make children salient about the task, about the pragmatics of the task, and all these kind of things. But still, all these things considered, there seems to be a difference between what they do with some and what they do with other constructions that give rise to scalar implicatures, right? And yeah, so there seems to be this general tendency of children to be more tolerant to pragmatic violations, right? But then again, also this does not explain these different results across experiments, across languages, especially using different scalar items. Okay, so yeah, very interesting, and we don't know exactly how to integrate all these results to make a sort of a complete theory of scalar implicature acquisition. But yeah, thanks a lot. Okay, is there any other comment, question, thought about this paper, previous papers, everything, life, pragmatics, linguistics? Anything you want to ask? Anything you want to discuss?
I have a question about the paper. What are we supposed to write it on? Like, it's the instructions you gave us were really vague, so I don't even know where to start. Yeah. So it's up to you. So you can do whatever you want. Okay, you can write it on a general topic that you want to discuss, or you can write it on specific papers that you want to discuss, or you can extend the discussions about the papers you presented, or you can discuss about other papers that you haven't presented. You can discuss about other papers that other people have presented,
or even other papers that were not included in the ones that we talked about, but maybe that are still related to the topic. So you're really left free to decide what you prefer to write about. The only one important thing, the only one requirement is that, of course, it has to be relevant to the topics that we have discussed, right? So in general, ambiguity of interpretation and relationship between grammatical constructions and different interpretation that you can assign to sentences. And I don't want you to just copy and paste parts of a paper, right? Or just rephrase sentences from a given paper. So I want you to sort of add a little bit of your own thoughts, or about some discussion about the topics that are included in the paper, as well as probably summarizing the results with your own words. Okay, is this does this help you? Is this kind of clear?
Not that much. Is there like a specific structure of the paper that you're looking for? No.
So I mean, the paper that I got from NESA, which was completely fine, was a more extended presentation of the 3 experiments that were included in the paper that she presented, and also some discussion. So that was completely fine. So you can do that, or you can take a more general topic, scope ambiguity, scalar implicatures, numerical meaning, acquisition of language, tolerance of violations, VP conjunction, whatever you want, and you can tackle that topic from a more theoretical, more experimental perspective, or whatever you prefer. Okay, if you don't know where to start from, try to think about a topic that you particularly liked, or that you think it's more interesting, or try to pick up a paper that struck your interest particularly, and then work on that. So yeah, you are basically left free to discuss what you prefer. Okay. If you need some specific advice, if you have no idea, then I can tell you you can write about this topic or this paper, right? But I guess it's better if you have the freedom of deciding what you prefer. Okay. But yeah, if you have any doubt, write me, and I'll be glad to help you.
Okay, great. Thank
okay
you.
Cool. Any other question? Any other comment? Okay, so I guess this is it. Thanks so much. It's been actually very, very interesting for me as well. It was a great chance to go through a lot of experiments and a lot of topics. And I must say that your presentations were really, really good. So it also helped me a lot to sort of have this stuff more fresh in my memory. And yeah, also the discussion we had were very, very, very good. And I hope this was understandable for you. I hope at least that I made you aware of a lot of problems that are still very hotly debated in the contemporary literature on acquisition and on theory, right? And also about this constant communication and constant relationship between purely theoretical issues and more psycholinguistic issues related to how actually we do interpret these constructions when we actually use them in real communication, and also how this happen in real time. Okay, and yeah, thanks so much, and I wish you a nice holidays or summer. And again, if you have any questions or any doubts, do not hesitate to write me. Okay. And yeah, I guess this is it. So I will put this